Hi, everyone. I'm John Fenzel. Greetings from Annapolis, Maryland. For several years, I worked on the personal staff of the Secretary of Defense, and one of the responsibilities we had was to review each Medal of Honor recommendation prior to sending it in to the Secretary of Defense for his approval. And in that time, I saw quite a few Medal of Honor nominations, and I reviewed them all for the Army. Every Medal of Honor nomination, is incredibly impressive, but I copied one of them and saved it because of the lasting impression that it made on me. And here it is. It's for Corporal Tibor Rubin, and it's dated the 24th of November, 2004, so 14 years ago. Not many of these nominations and packets are ultimately approved. Of all the ones that I've had the opportunity to review, though, Tibor Rubin's absolutely stood out for a lot of reasons, for his actions on the battlefield without question, but also because of his incredible life story, because he survived captivity not just once, but twice in his lifetime. First at a Nazi concentration camp, and then later as a prisoner of war in Korea. So, to understand everything that Tibor went through, you have to go all the way back, I think, and that's what makes his story so incredible. Tibor Rubin was born on June 18th, 1929, in a Hungarian town with about 120 other Jewish families, and he was one of 6 children. And then in the spring of 1944, Tibor's parents decided to have him and his sister accompany a small group into neutral Switzerland where they thought they would be safe. But before they could get there, they were caught and they were handed over to the Gestapo. Tibor was sent to a hard labor concentration camp in Austria called Mauthausen, and while he was there, he developed this really keen survival instinct. He stole food and he raided garbage, and he learned a lot about improvised medical techniques. And so, with a lot of pride, he called himself the Little Rat. By the end of his captivity, he looked like a skeleton, and that's when American troops liberated Mauthausen. And for the first time in 14 months, he was finally free. And it was at that moment that he made a vow. He said, if the Lord will have me, if I ever go to America, I'm going to become a G.I. Joe. So after Mauthausen, Tibor spent 3 years in a displaced persons camp in Germany before reuniting with his older half-siblings who had long before settled in the United States. His parents and other members of his family had been killed in the Holocaust. So when he arrived in America, he worked as a shoemaker and as an apprentice butcher. He tried to join the Army, but he failed the Army's entrance examination because of the language barrier. He tried again in 1950, but this time Tibor was very determined. And so with that commitment, combined with the Army's need for troops as the Korean War was just beginning, that won over the recruiter, who advised him that this time to look at the answers of the other test takers. He did just that, and he passed the entrance exam. Tibor asked to be sent to Korea, but his commander advised him against it since he wasn't even a U.S. citizen yet. Tibor's reply was, well, what about the other soldiers? I cannot leave my fellow brothers. So he landed on the front lines just as the Korean War was starting and was assigned to the 8th Cavalry Regiment of the 1st Cavalry Division. It was the summer of 1950, and Tibor was repeatedly being volunteered by his first sergeant, a guy by the name of Arthur Payton, who was rabidly anti-Semitic and bigoted for every suicide, certain death mission that came up. But probably to the first sergeant's surprise and great frustration, Tibor returned every single time. On one of those missions in October 1950, he was sent to defend a strategic hill to keep open this road link as the company withdrew to safety near the Pusan perimeter. So he armed himself with grenades and guns, and he waited, knowing that First Sergeant Payton had no intention whatsoever of relieving him. So North Korean regulars attacked at dawn, and Rubin repelled them alone, saying they became hysterical as they swarmed the hill like ants. And he said, I didn't have time to get scared, so I just went crazy. Of course, what had happened was that the Chinese had crossed the Yalu River into North Korea and were attacking all of the American troops, who were now trapped and surprised and unprepared way far inside North Korea. A lot of fellow soldiers in his regiment were killed over days of fighting, but Tibor slowed the Chinese and North Korean advance with only a machine gun. Alone, Tibor inflicted a staggering number of casualties against waves and waves of North Korean soldiers. By the time he was taken prisoner by the North Koreans, he had been severely wounded by shrapnel in his hand and his chest and his leg, and he and other members of his unit were lined up and were about ready to be executed on the spot. Luckily, the Chinese showed up and they stopped the North Koreans, and then Tibor would spend the next 30 months in a prisoner of war camp. He and his comrades faced constant hunger and filth and disease, not to mention the absolutely freezing temperatures, and so most of his fellow soldiers just gave up. Leo Cormier, who has a statement in here, one of his fellow POWs said, "No one wanted to help anyone. Everyone was for himself." The exception was Tibor Rubin. Almost every evening, Tibor would sneak out of the prison camp to steal food from the Chinese and North Korean supply depots, barley, millet, animal feed, knowing that he'd be shot if he was caught. So this is why the first part of the story is so important, because Tibor had picked up really essential survival skills while he was in Mauthausen concentration camp. He later say that the most important of those lessons was the mind could prevail even as the body suffered, and he kept his fellow soldiers by constantly talking to them and encouraging them. He said, "You cannot just give up." He said, "I don't think the Lord is going to help you. He's only going to help you if you help yourself. So you have to try and get home somehow." Cormier said that he shared food evenly among all the GIs. He took care of us. He nursed us. He carried us to the latrine. Helping his fellow men was the most important thing to him, he said. His captors repeatedly offered to repatriate him to Hungary, by then behind the Iron Curtain, but he declined every single time. Instead, he stayed on in this isolated camp that Americans by that time were calling Death Valley. He did his best to raise morale when other soldiers were paralyzed by fear or freezing weather during this brutal winter of 1950 and 1951. Tibor later remembered some of them just gave up and some of them prayed to be taken. He did his best to rally them, and he reminded them of the relatives that were praying for them and for their safe return home. Tibor carried sick men to the latrine. He spent hours picking lace from the hair of his fellow soldiers. More than 1,600 POWs died that winter at Camp 5 in Korea. The survivors of Camp 5 credited Tibor Rubin with keeping them alive. In April of 1953, Tibor was suddenly returned to the United States in exchange of sick and wounded prisoners. He wanted to get on with his life. He became a U.S. citizen. He settled in California, and he worked in his brother's Long Beach liquor store. So, okay, just think about that. He then became a U.S. citizen. He wasn't even an American citizen during those 3 years that he was fighting on the front lines when he was a POW. In 1963, he married Yvonne Myers, a Holocaust survivor from the Netherlands who he had met at a dance for Jewish singles. By this time, Teddy Rubin, as Tibor had become known, largely avoided talk about World War II and Korea, but in the 1980s, he attended a reunion of veterans where he reconnected with members of his unit, and they expressed shock that he hadn't received the Medal of Honor. He was told that he'd been nominated 4 times by his comrades, but there are always problems with the paperwork. The Pentagon now says that someone in his chain of command may have stymied the process because Rubin was a Hungarian Jew. Of course, First Sergeant Payton was among those who were trying to stop it. The Jewish war veterans of the United States began lobbying in the late 1980s for recognition of Tibor's heroism, and in 1993 a study was commissioned by the Army to investigate racial discrimination in the awarding of medals. And then finally in 2001, Congress ordered the war records of Jewish and Latino service members who might have unfairly been denied the Medal of Honor, and Tibor Rubin headed that list. And so in 2005, President George W. Bush presented the Medal of Honor to Rubin in a ceremony at the White House for his actions in 1950, and he was credited with saving as many as 40 of his fellow prisoners. Tibor regularly volunteered at the Long Beach Veterans Hospital. He earned an award for more than 20,000 hours of volunteer work. The VA Long Beach Medical Center where he worked has now been renamed in his honor as the Tibor Rubin VA Medical Center. It's also interesting that Tibor Rubin is the only Holocaust survivor to receive the Medal of Honor. Tibor died of natural causes on December 5th, 2015, 3 years ago this month at his home in Garden Grove, California. He was 86 years old. So that's what really struck me about the story as I read through this packet a decade and a half ago. If you were ever searching for an incredibly harrowing account of inspirational, courageous, selfless, servant leadership, I think Tibor Rubin has to top any list that you come up with. So that's Tibor Rubin, ladies and gentlemen. I thought you'd like to know.